They spend so much time warning you about narcissists, the ones who drain, manipulate, and consume everything in their path. But almost no one talks about what happens when the person doing all the giving finally runs out of something to give and quietly stops. Over time, this self abandonment doesn't feel dramatic. It doesn't announce itself with a single breaking point. It builds quietly in layers that are easy to justify in the moment. A message ignored becomes, they were just busy. A hurtful comment becomes, they didn't mean it like that. A pattern of inconsistency becomes, everyone has flaws. The empath doesn't usually notice the cost while it is happening because their attention is locked on maintaining emotional stability in the relationship. They become the interpreter, the stabilizer, the one who translates chaos into something survivable. But the nervous system keeps track of everything, and eventually it reaches a point where it can no longer stay neutral. What follows is not always an explosion. More often, it is a quiet internal exhaustion that changes the way the empath experiences connection itself. The same situations that once triggered over-explaining now start to trigger silence. The same conversations that once led to emotional repair now lead to emotional withdrawal. It begins with hesitation, then distance, then a kind of internal numbness that feels unfamiliar at first, almost like something is missing. But what's missing is not love. It is the compulsive need to fix what is constantly breaking. This is the moment many people misunderstand. From the outside, it can look like the empath is giving up too easily or becoming cold. But internally, something very different is happening. The emotional system that once overfunctioned is beginning to down-regulate. It is stepping back from environments where empathy was continuously extracted but rarely reciprocated. And this is where the transformation begins. Because when an empath stops overgiving, they are not losing their nature. They are exiting survival mode. For a long time, their empathy was not fully free. It was reactive. It was tied to tension, to responsibility, to the belief that if they didn't manage the emotional state of others, things would fall apart. That belief creates an invisible burden, the idea that peace is something they must produce, even at their own expense. But when collapse finally arrives, when emotional exhaustion becomes undeniable, something shifts beneath the surface. The empath begins to realize a difficult truth. They were not actually responsible for regulating other people's emotions. They were only conditioned to believe they were. And once that illusion breaks, everything starts to reorganize internally. They begin noticing patterns they previously ignored, not just in others, but in themselves. Why they stayed longer than they should have. Why they kept explaining the same boundaries that were never respected. Why they confused intensity with intimacy. Why emotional inconsistency felt strangely familiar rather than alarming. This awareness does not come as a single insight. It comes in waves, moments of clarity followed by moments of doubt, then deeper clarity again. It is a reconfiguration of perception itself, and as perception changes, behavior inevitably follows. The empath becomes more selective, not in a judgmental way, but in a protective way. They stop engaging in emotional labor that has no return. They stop entering conversations where their role is to endlessly clarify what was already made clear. They stop trying to earn consistency from people who only offer unpredictability. At first, this feels unnatural, even uncomfortable, because their old identity was built around emotional availability. Saying no once felt like abandonment. Silence felt like cruelty. Distance felt like failure, but over time they begin to understand something crucial. Boundaries are not rejection, they are structure, and structure is what makes real connection possible. Without structure, empathy becomes self-erasure. With structure, empathy becomes discernment. This is the turning point where the empath is no longer simply reacting to emotional environments. They are choosing them, and that changes everything. People who once benefited from unlimited access to their emotional energy begin to notice the shift first. The empath no longer over-explains. They no longer rush to repair emotional tension that they did not create. They no longer respond to inconsistency with patience that costs them their own stability. And because the dynamic is no longer being balanced by one person's overfunctioning, it starts to reveal itself clearly for what it always was. Some relationships dissolve at this stage, not because the empath becomes unkind, but because the imbalance can no longer be maintained. And although that dissolution can feel painful, it is not the same pain as before. It is not confusion. It is not self-blame. It is clarity with grief, rather than attachment with denial. What emerges afterward is something far more stable. The empath does not become less sensitive. They become less available to emotional chaos. Their sensitivity is no longer used as a tool for survival inside unstable dynamics. It becomes something quieter, more grounded, more intentional. They still feel deeply, but they no longer abandon themselves in the process of feeling. And this is the part most people never understand about their transformation. It is not that they stop caring. It is that they stop disappearing inside what they care about. They begin to recognize that real connection does not require self-neglect, that understanding someone else should not come at the cost of misunderstanding themselves. That emotional depth is not measured by how much pain you can endure, but by how honestly you can remain present without losing your center. In that sense, the collapse was never an ending. It was a correction, a psychological reset that removed everything the empath mistook for love, but that was actually just emotional overextension. And what remains after that reset is not hardness, it is clarity, not detachment from people, but attachment to truth. And once an empath learns that difference, they don't go back to who they were before, because they finally understand that the version of them who tolerated everything was not the strongest version. It was the most depleted one. And what comes next is not survival anymore. It is conscious living. And when it flips, it often confuses both sides of the dynamic. For the empath, this stage does not feel like power or victory. It rarely feels dramatic at all. In fact, it can feel strangely empty at first. The same emotional triggers that once created urgency now barely register. Situations that previously demanded immediate explanation or repair no longer generate the same internal pressure. It is not that the empath has become indifferent in the cold sense. It is that their nervous system is no longer automatically recruited into chaos. And that difference is critical, because for a long time, their emotional world was built around responsiveness. They were conditioned, slowly, repeatedly, almost invisibly, to believe that connection requires constant emotional availability, that love is proven through endurance, that understanding must continue even when it becomes one-sided. So when that pattern breaks, the absence of reaction can feel unfamiliar even to them. Meanwhile, on the other side of the dynamic, this shift is interpreted very differently. When someone who once reacted consistently stops reacting, it creates instability in the system that was previously predictable. The emotional feedback loop no longer functions. What used to produce reassurance, attention, or engagement now produces nothing. And in psychological terms, unpredictability can be more disruptive than conflict itself. At first, there is often confusion. Messages may become more frequent. Tone may shift between casual and probing. Attempts may be made to reintroduce familiar emotional triggers, old disagreements, selective memories, subtle provocations designed to reestablish the previous pattern. Because from the outside, it looks like the empath is simply becoming distant. But internally, something far more fundamental has changed. They are no longer operating from emotional compulsion, and this is where the real reversal becomes visible. In the earlier phase of the relationship, the empath's emotional engagement acted like an invisible stabilizer. Even when things were unhealthy, even when the dynamic was draining, their participation kept the system alive. They provided continuity. They created predictability through effort, explanation, and emotional repair. But now, that stabilizing force has been removed, and what remains is the structure of the dynamic itself, without compensation. For the empath, this is often the moment where clarity sharpens, not because new information appears, but because distortion disappears. Without constant emotional noise, patterns become easier to see. The inconsistencies that were once rationalized begin to stand out. The cycles that were once emotionally justified now look mechanical, predictable, repetitive. There is a specific kind of realization that often emerges here. Nothing was ever truly resolving, it was looping. And once that is seen clearly, it cannot be unseen. This is also where emotional boundaries begin to stabilize into something more permanent. Not reactive boundaries set in moments of frustration, but quiet internal limits that do not require external validation. The empath no longer needs to explain why something feels wrong in order to justify stepping back from it. The feeling itself becomes sufficient information. That is a major psychological shift, because earlier, their perception was often filtered through relational responsibility. If they are hurting, I should understand it. If they are struggling, I should help. If they are reacting strongly, I should adjust myself. But after saturation, that automatic translation begins to dissolve. And in its place comes a simpler internal question. Is this sustainable for me? Not in a selfish sense, but in a structural one. And that shift removes them from the emotional center of the dysfunction. What often follows is a phase of resistance, not necessarily from the empath, but from the environment that was accustomed to their overfunctioning. Old dynamics tend to push for restoration. The system attempts to return to equilibrium by encouraging the empath to re-enter their previous role, the explainer, the mediator, the emotional absorber. But the empath no longer fully fits that role. They may still care, but caring no longer translates into self-abandonment. And this is where many of the old labels begin to surface again. Cold, distant, changed, unpredictable. These labels are not always intentional manipulation. Sometimes they are genuine confusion from people who are used to a certain version of the empath. But from the empath's perspective, nothing has become colder, only clearer. Because what is often misread as emotional withdrawal is actually emotional reallocation. The energy that once went into repairing unstable patterns is now redirected inward toward clarity, stability, and self-regulation. And that reallocation changes their entire internal landscape. Anxiety decreases, not because life becomes easier, but because internal conflict decreases. The constant scanning for emotional shifts in others begins to quiet. The need to interpret silence, tone, and inconsistency loses urgency. The nervous system is no longer living in a state of continuous anticipation. In that space, something new becomes possible. Thoughts become more linear. Decisions become less reactive. Boundaries stop feeling like emotional risks and start feeling like natural structures. The empath begins to recognize that peace is not something they create by managing others. It is something they protect by managing access. And perhaps the most important realization of all begins to form quietly in the background. Not everyone who is used to your emotional availability is aligned with your well-being. That realization does not arrive with anger. It arrives with simplicity. And simplicity, psychologically, is often what ends long cycles of confusion. Because once emotional complexity is no longer required to justify staying, leaving becomes less dramatic internally, even if it is still difficult externally. At that point, the empath is no longer operating from the question of, how do I fix this? They are operating from the question of, why was I trying to fix something that kept breaking in the same way? And that question changes everything that follows, because it signals the end of unconscious participation and the beginning of conscious choice, not withdrawal from love, but withdrawal from distortion. And in that space, where reaction used to be automatic and exhaustion used to be constant, something quieter begins to form. A sense of internal authority that does not depend on emotional chaos to validate itself. And once that is established, the old dynamic cannot fully restart in the same way again, because the person who once held it together at their own expense is no longer available in the same form, and what replaces them is not absence, it is awareness. Silent treatment only has power when it is met with emotional participation. It is not a strategy that exists independently. It is a relational mechanism. It depends on something very specific. The other person still believing that emotional repair is their responsibility, still feeling the discomfort of distance, still carrying the internal pressure to fix what has been disrupted. In psychological terms, it functions only when there is an active attachment response. When that response is present, silence becomes loaded. It creates uncertainty. It activates overthinking. It pulls the mind into interpretation. What did I do? How do I fix this? How do I restore connection? And in that state, the silent treatment becomes a lever that influences behavior without direct communication. But that entire mechanism collapses when the emotional system on the other side no longer engages in the same way. A fed-up empath does not necessarily respond with confrontation. That is a common misconception. The shift is far less dramatic externally, but far more significant internally. What actually changes is participation. They stop stepping into the emotional role that the dynamic depends on. They stop trying to decode silence as a problem to be solved. They stop filling in the gaps with explanation, patience, or self-blame. And once that interpretive effort ends, silence loses its psychological leverage. Because silence is only powerful when it is being translated into meaning. Without that translation, it is just absence. And absence, when no longer emotionally charged, becomes neutral. This is where the dynamic begins to quietly break apart. From the outside, nothing obvious may seem to happen at first. There is no confrontation that marks the shift, no dramatic announcement that the pattern has ended. Instead, what changes is responsiveness, or more precisely, the absence of automatic responsiveness. Messages may still be received, situations may still unfold, but the internal urgency that once accompanied them is no longer activated. The empath is no longer entering the familiar cycle of reaction, repair, and emotional recalibration. And this creates a structural imbalance in the relationship. Because systems that rely on emotional feedback need consistent input to maintain their pattern. When that input stops arriving in the expected form, the system does not immediately understand why. It simply continues attempting the same strategies that used to produce results. More silence, more indirect pressure, more attempts to trigger engagement. But what is missing now is not understanding on the empath's part. It is participation, and that distinction is critical. The empath is not necessarily becoming detached in the cold, dismissive sense that people often assume. What is actually happening is a shift in internal processing. Emotional input is no longer automatically converted into responsibility. It is being observed rather than absorbed. That alone changes everything. Because when emotional signals are no longer absorbed, they lose their ability to dictate behavior. Over time, this leads to a very specific psychological outcome. Emotional neutrality replaces emotional compulsion, not indifference, but non-reactivity. The capacity to remain present without being pulled into resolution cycles that were never truly resolving anything. And from that point, the old dynamic cannot fully sustain itself. On the other side, where emotional reinforcement was previously predictable, unpredictability becomes destabilizing. Not because of intensity, but because of inconsistency in response. The expected loop, action, reaction, emotional repair, no longer completes itself. This is often where confusion emerges. Attempts may intensify briefly, as systems tend to seek familiar equilibrium. But without the empath re-entering their former role, those attempts gradually lose structure. They no longer produce the same emotional outcome, which means they no longer serve the same function. What remains is a pattern without reinforcement. And patterns without reinforcement naturally dissolve. Meanwhile, internally, the empath is undergoing a different kind of reorganization. One that is less about learning something new and more about unlearning automatic participation. They begin to recognize how much of their previous emotional engagement was not actually choice, but conditioning. The instinct to explain, the reflex to soften tension, the habit of assuming responsibility for emotional imbalance. These are not personality flaws. They are adaptive responses developed in environments where emotional stability depended on their participation. But adaptation is not the same as alignment. And once that difference becomes clear, behavior begins to shift accordingly. Boundaries stop being reactions to conflict and start becoming default states. Emotional distance is no longer a punishment or defense mechanism. It becomes a form of clarity, not because the empath has stopped caring, but because caring is no longer fused with self-erasure. This is where one of the most important psychological reversals occurs. The empath no longer interprets emotional discomfort as a signal to re-engage. They begin to recognize it as information rather than obligation, something to understand, not something to fix. And that single shift removes them from the center of the cycle entirely. What used to feel like emotional responsibility begins to feel like emotional overextension. What used to feel like love begins to reveal itself as imbalance sustained by their participation. And what used to feel like confusion begins to resolve into pattern recognition. Not every dynamic is meant to be repaired. Some are meant to be understood and then exited. And once that realization stabilizes internally, silence no longer functions as a tool against them. It simply becomes what it is, absence without influence. At that point, the most significant change is not in how others behave toward them. It is in how little that behavior determines their internal state. And that is the real end of the cycle. Not when communication stops, but when emotional control no longer depends on it. The truth is, the story was never just about the narcissist. It was also about the empath, the person who stayed longer than they should have, loved harder than most people could, and carried emotional burdens that were never truly theirs to carry. For years, they convinced themselves that understanding was enough, that patience would heal what was broken, that if they could just love a little better, explain a little more, sacrifice a little deeper, things would eventually change. But eventually, reality catches up with hope. And when it does, something profound happens inside the empath. They stop confusing self-sacrifice with love. They stop mistaking emotional exhaustion for loyalty. They stop believing that understanding someone's pain requires enduring their behavior. The empathy remains, but it is no longer being used against them. It is no longer flowing endlessly toward people who have no intention of valuing it. That is the transformation few people talk about. Because the final stage of an empath's journey is not becoming cold, it is becoming clear. They learn that compassion without boundaries becomes self-destruction. They learn that not everyone who is hurting is willing to heal. They learn that seeing the good in someone does not obligate them to stay and suffer for that potential. Most importantly, they learn that protecting their peace is not selfish. It is necessary. And when that realization fully settles in, something remarkable happens. The empath stops chasing explanations. They stop seeking closure from people incapable of giving it. They stop waiting for accountability, validation, or understanding from those who were never willing to offer it. Their energy returns to them. Their focus returns to them. Their life returns to them. The silence that follows is often misunderstood. Some call it indifference, others call it withdrawal. But in reality, it is something far more meaningful. It is the sound of a person finally choosing themselves after years of choosing everyone else. The fed-up empath is not dangerous because they seek revenge. They are powerful because they no longer need anything from the people who once had power over them. They no longer need approval. They no longer need apologies. They no longer need promises of change. They see what is in front of them, accept it for what it is, and move forward without carrying the weight of someone else's unfinished work. And that may be the greatest act of healing there is, because true healing is not becoming harder. It is not building walls so high that nobody can reach you. It is learning to keep your heart open while refusing to hand it to people who repeatedly break it. It is understanding that your empathy was never the weakness. The weakness was believing that your value depended on how much pain you could tolerate for someone else. So if you recognize yourself in this story, remember this. The moment you stop abandoning yourself to save others is the moment your real healing begins. The moment you choose self-respect over emotional survival, everything changes. And while that transformation may happen quietly, its impact echoes through every relationship, every boundary, and every decision that follows. Because in the end, the most powerful version of an empath is not the one who gives endlessly. It is the one who finally understands that their compassion is a gift, not an obligation, and starts treating it that way. And once that lesson is learned, there is no going back. Only forward, only growth, only freedom.